If I've felt anything in my decades of content creation, it's a deep-seated frustration with Adobe. For a long time, they were the go-to, but excitedly so. I vividly remember in high school taking the Adobe Photoshop class and learning all about the software. I was deep in Adobe before I even wrote my first line of code, which is crazy to say as someone who's mostly known for their software development stuff. I just loved the power that software gave me in creation, especially because I have like the worst handwriting ever. I felt so empowered by software getting to make things that were graphical and felt real in that way when I couldn't before. And Adobe's acquisition of Macromedia, the innovation in Photoshop, in After Effects, Premiere, Illustrator, Publisher, all of these programs made an incredibly powerful suite that empowered creators to make the new generation of content. However, they have held tight to their monopoly, and that monopoly has made them more and more painful as an end user. Things like Premiere refusing to cut off legacy support for old project versions, and the result is a very slow piece of software known primarily for its crashing. Or things like Photoshop having a whole different application on iPad where they kind of had to start from scratch with the development, and compatibility is still full of question marks. And certainly not a real embrace of the web, because Adobe doesn't know what the web is. They certainly don't know what live video is. Doesn't mean they're not trying. It doesn't mean they're not making cool things happen with their software. But those things are not focused on solving new problems or expanding the set of people who can solve problems with their software. On top of that, they charge a lot. They moved from a model where you would buy the piece of software one time and keep using it to a model where they charge monthly. And they are so aggressive about that there have been people who bought an Adobe license the proper way. They spent hundreds of dollars on CS5 or CS6. And now they're getting threats from Adobe's legal team saying that software is no longer permitted to be used for publications. And if they're not paying for a subscription of Adobe Cloud, they're not allowed to use the software they paid for in the past. The outright desire to frustrate those core users is baffling. And I get the desire to move to a monthly subscription model. It is how you sustain yourself as a business. But with software that isn't really cloud-based, their expenses are primarily sending the files to the user to install them, and then paying your developers and paying to make sure that the software isn't piratable. Most of Adobe's money is spent securing the software they've already built, not in innovation and creating new things. I think that what we've seen as a result is the challenge of Adobe coming from multiple different, really interesting directions. On one side, we have companies like Serif, who made Affinity software. Affinity is not too unlike the OG way Adobe did things, where there's Affinity Photo, which is their equivalent to Photoshop. They also have Affinity Designer and Publisher, which are very similar to the programs in the Adobe suite you can guess. Designer is a really good Illustrator alternative. And the goal of Affinity is to make something that is as close as possible to the use case we had with Adobe, but built from scratch, super performant, iPad ready day one, and a one-time purchase. You can buy any of the Adobe apps, either the mobile app for $20 or the desktop apps for $55, and that is a lifetime license. I bought my Affinity Photo license for $20 on sale for the Windows version like 8 years ago. And I paid $40 for the Mac one not too long ago either. And I've been using those to edit every single thumbnail on the channel since it started. It's fantastic software. There's other similar options that are browser-based and free. I know Photopea has come up a bit. Photopea is going to complain because I have an ad block on. But Photopea lets you have a very similar to Photoshop experience, but entirely based in the browser. And it's very internet aware, where it has these defaults that are social images for different platforms that you can start with. I just want 920 1080. Now you have a full Photoshop clone, works great, all in the browser. There are other companies that go in a different direction though, taking something that Adobe is used for, but it's not great at, and challenging that by building something that's perfect for it. The most obvious example for that is for sure Figma. Figma's goal is to make it way easier to design things that are primarily applications or websites, like stuff that people interact with on their device. People were making mocks in Photoshop and Illustrator. I know that. I did it all the time. I would design my new apps or websites in Photoshop and then go reproduce them in actual code. Figma's goal is to make it as easy as possible to do prototyping and I guess the right word is wireframing, but not quite because they're so deeply well designed. Figma took a thing that people used Adobe for, but it wasn't great for, and made it a way better experience for that thing, knowing that that subset was a big enough market to make a successful company. So they took a huge chunk of their potential market and absolutely won app mocking. Sketch did a similar thing, but they were much more focused on their desktop app, whereas Figma was desktop and browser and more focused on code exports, collaboration, working with your team, making the designer working with engineers workflow as good as possible. It did a fantastic job at that. I see a lot of people bring up Canva, which is also a similar concept. It's focused on design primarily for websites, as well as like very graphical things, focused on like images, text, and all the fancy graphics you could do with that. Whereas Figma is more on structure and organization and how applications like interact and feel. Both are fantastic solutions, competing to a large extent, both in overlapping subsets of a market that Adobe did not do a great job of acknowledging. Then there is a third tier. So we went over the first two. Tier one is things that are doing stuff the way Adobe used to for the customers that miss the way Adobe used to behave. Thing two is customers who have identified markets that Adobe doesn't understand well enough and made specialist products to win those markets. Thing three is kind of like thing two, but I want to define this as different because it really meaningfully is. It's the companies that are on like a fundamental level, challenging the core workflows of how stuff is done while still producing end results very similar to what people saw in Adobe. So something like Figma has a workflow that's meant to feel similar to Photoshop with results that are very different and simpler and all the collab stuff too. Something like Descript is fundamentally challenging how we do video editing. I think that the Descript guys are on to some really cool stuff. I'm picky about the video companies in particular that I shout out for a lot of reasons, primarily just because I don't trust a lot of them. I see what they're doing and it's clear that they're not using the thing they're building. Descript uses this product. It is very clear. I have seen enough from them to know that for sure. The magic of Descript is you edit the text to edit the video. It's much more focused on the script and the auto-generated captions than it is about the traditional editing workflow. They're starting to build a more traditional editing workflow on top of it, but the core concept of editing via text instead of timeline is fascinating and has made a lot of content like what I'm doing here significantly faster to chop up and get out. I have been incredibly impressed with my experience with Descript. I know it's not super stable for a lot of people. It's also not great at really long video, which is annoying because what I want to do is chop a 6-hour VOD with it. And it tends to choke up at over like half an hour to an hour of footage. And it's also a big clunky Electron app, but it is a very powerful piece of software that I have gotten a lot more out of than I expected to. And it's a great example of how you can challenge Adobe by doing something fundamentally different from the way that they like to. Super cool stuff. There's also CapCut, which is fascinating because CapCut isn't changing their workflow a whole lot compared to other solutions. In fact, their desktop software is like an eerie minimalist clone of Final Cut, which is strange. But their interesting differentiator is that they started on mobile, and they started very heavily on mobile. It's by ByteDance, who owns TikTok, so it was very focused on doing things for like vertical video the TikTok way. But they, a few weeks ago, after years of focusing on mobile, finally made CapCut for desktop. And it's one of the best performing video editors I've used, which I did not expect. It's an actual native app doing a ton of GPU acceleration shit. And the result, especially on Windows with a powerful GPU, is some of the best editor performance I have seen, especially for really long videos. And I did not expect that from the company that makes TikTok. But their focus being mobile first means they get a very different market, and they can execute on that market a lot faster than Adobe, who still kind of sucks at mobile and doesn't know what their strategy is there. And now they're desperately playing catch up. But yeah, I think that these are the three different plans of attack for Adobe. You can do things the old way, the way that they used to, and they no longer are. knowing that there are customers who still want that and will pay for it. You can go pick a subset of their customers that aren't served well enough and serve the hell out of them. Or you can pick a market that they do not understand or are just not aware of, that is a bigger market like mobile editing, and execute on that faster than they could even notice it exists. And I think those three methods are all methods that are going to eat away at Adobe's core market significantly. I don't think they're ever actually going to die. They're one of those companies that is just too popular and too deeply ingrained in workflows for millions of people that will ever see it truly die. But I do think we're now in an era where there are better tools that make more sense for most users. I am super impressed with all of the tools that I talked about today, and I definitely recommend checking them out if you haven't yet. Give Adobe a second shot. You might be surprised. Thank you for taking the time. I'm hoping to do more content like this, more businessy content as well. Usually we're here to talk about code stuff. So if you like programming, you like software engineering stuff, make sure you give me a sub if you haven't already. See you in the next one. Leave a comment if you enjoyed the video.